You may recall that I ended last week's session having kind of personally thought of the year 313 as the year of the coming of age of the church. Because the Edict of Milan was issued, stopping persecution. One individual down in Alexandria named Athanasius, and not the wizard, entered into service Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, because another individual in North Africa by the name of Pachomius was baptized, and he was to become the father of the Cenobitic monasticism that was developing. And finally, because another individual by the name of Antony, also in North Africa, withdrew to the desert to find God and became basically the father of Aromatic monasticism in the Nitrian desert of Egypt. Kind of switch here. You also may recall this slide from last time. It looked a little bit different, but it was relating to, even during his life, Diocletian's division of the authority, the Augustus Caesars and the Caesars or sub-Caesars, I call them, in dividing the empire, the Roman Empire, into the eastern and the western parts. Diocletian had gone over and taken the Eastern Empire. Maximian's sons, I mentioned Maxentius and Maximinus, had become the kind of sub-Caesars, not the Augustus Caesars. Constantius, we mentioned, had died. Galerius had passed on. Kind of an interesting part of the history is that Diocletian had, I don't know how many children he had, but he had a wife by the name of Priscilla, and he had at least one daughter. And they had confessed Christianity. And in around 303, which was the time of the meeting when St. George came in, when the persecutions, when Diocletian was clearly becoming anti-Christian. His wife and daughter had apostatized, renounced their faith. And then as time went on, the persecutions got worse and worse, and they, particularly his wife Priscilla, had appealed to him to reduce or stop these persecutions, and he refused. When he died, he left I don't know whether it was a will or whatever, but he specified that his wife, Priscilla, and daughter come under the care of Licinius. We talked about the fact that Constantine went into battle with the sign of Cairo and the instruction in the vision to, by this sign, conquer. And he went into battle at the Battle of Milvian Bridge with Maxentius and won. So that takes care of him. Uh, Because he was anti-Christian, strongly anti-Christian, and really became anti-Christian even after he signed the agreement with Constantine to stop persecutions. Priscilla and her daughter from Diocletian fled from him and went under the protection of Maximinus. But Licinius destroyed Maximinus and took that opportunity to execute Diocletian's wife and daughter. The church subsequently recognized Priscilla as a saint, Saint Alexander, I think it is. Because he wasn't compliant with Constantine and was strongly anti-Christian, and because he was a competing emperor, I guess, in 324, Constantine defeats him. And that restores the empire under Constantine. Just thought you might want to know that little tidbit. This map is not terribly clear here, but there's a really nice copy of it that I'm going to give you in the handouts. And Constantine wanted to create a center for this renewed single Roman Empire, to be closer to the Roman armies, what were the reasons that historians speculate or know that he did this? Well, I'm just going to mention several. I'm speculating, but he probably had a pretty good sized ego and wanted to create something for himself. The armies were, at this time, you recall, trying to deal with invading forces from the north and from Asia, and so he probably did want to locate closer, in closer proximity to those armies. For quite some time, the government in Rome, up until this time, had been expanding. The Senate was, perhaps we could say, Obama-like. Big government was better. Taxation, particularly among the upper class in Rome, was increasing in order to try and deal with the invasions and the costs of that. And, perhaps he wanted to just kind of get rid of all that and not have to deal with a political establishment and kind of a bureaucratic establishment in Rome. This leads up into the Black Sea. This is the Sea of Marmara, which is basically an extension of the Mediterranean Sea. There were lots of trade routes out in those directions, and also trade routes, particularly by land, up along this body of water which empties into the Bosphorus. It's called the Golden Horn, and it's basically an estuary, and there were lots of trade routes that had established along here up into places like Bulgaria and the northern countries, Georgia. So it was really ideal from that standpoint, from trade routes and from an economic standpoint. It was an ideal location. It was a place that was easy to fortify. It was kind of naturally fortified from invasions from the east, as you can see here, by water. This area, in particular this area up in here, was one of the most desirable natural ports in the world. So, both from the Black Sea and from the Mediterranean Sea, it was kind of an ideal place to establish shipping and trade by water. So that's what he did. I guess another plus for it was that there was actually a city here before he built Constantinople, and it had been there since about 600 BC. It was called Byzantium. So in some ways it was already existing. But in any event, he built the city of Constantinople at that time, and he called it was called the New Rome. It was quite a city, and particularly remarkable because he had it built in 6 years. He brought, well, I say he did it, I'm sure he didn't do all this work, but he had all kinds of really kind of outstanding examples of art and construction materials brought here to create many of the buildings and the edifices and the art that really became outstanding in Constantinople. He brought all kinds of marble, for example, and existing columns. Where did he get those things? I mean, he built it in 6 years, so it's not like there was probably time for artisans to go out and like chop all these columns out of marble. Well, he got a lot of these things, okay, from other parts of the Roman Empire, from Rome. He took these things from other places and brought them here. Maybe it's also worthwhile to think about the Roman side of all this, in addition to some of the reasons that he did or may have had for creating Constantinople. Let's pretend that we're Romans, creating this big place. It's going to compete with us. It's going to outshine our citizen, our government. It's called the New Rome. What's wrong with our Rome? It's going to shift economics and trade routes. So maybe, you know, that's a perspective of why, as history progressed, there was some conflict, or not altogether positive thought, between the West and the East. This city had more than 7 miles of fortified walls. That's what this is here. And there's another set of them here. Lots of churches.
You say 7 miles?
Right. Isn't that?
I would think it'd be a lot more, wouldn't it?
Might have been.
Well, the down there on the bottom it says on the legend it's 3,000 meters, right? No, 2,000 meters.
It's 7 miles of protected walls.
Yeah, 1,600 meters
two-
to a mile.
Well,
Right.
it had lots of protected walls.
I think that whole distance is 2,000.
It was
Okay.
very fortified, and of course it needed, unlike over here, it needed some kind of fortification here. So you can look at your map and kind of check out what Constantinople was like. As I said, he built it in 6 years, which is absolutely remarkable. And it was dedicated on May the 11th of 330. Constantine never placed himself under Christian teachers or bishops. He considered himself the bishop of bishops. He also sought the goodwill of the Christian God, but he maintained good relations with observers and other ancient religions. Some historians give serious question as to whether or not he was a Christian. But the fact is that he was baptized on his deathbed in 337. And the church considers him a saint. So we're around 320, and we could look at some things that are developments within the church that are established by this time. There are lots of churches being built throughout the empire. Christianity had become the, quote, state religion, unquote. And the architectural structure of many of those churches became what's called a basilica, which is a church that's in the shape of a cross. There are usually several rows of, depending on the size, of columns. There are lots of columns in these churches. There's an apse. Now, if you use your imagination and you take out the columns, and particularly with, at least to me, with the wooden structures that are now here upstairs that have the icon of the Theotokos and the icon of St. Raphael, it's a little bit like a basilica. Of course, it has the apse on the altar. By 320, incense was in routine use, and clerical garments had become standardized. They would change someone in the future under the Turkish domination. Processionals and choirs were in existence. We talked about this earlier, but by now the relics of saints were routinely venerated in the churches. And around this time, St. Helena, who was Constantine's mother, traveled to Jerusalem with the intent of finding the cross of Christ. And I guess left instructions along the way that if she found it, they would build a large fire there, a bonfire, that could be seen by the next city, and that they should build a fire. And so that was the way that the message would get back to Constantinople, that she had found the cross. She found the cross, was set the fires, the message was sent. And she distributed, or began the distribution of pieces of the cross throughout the empire. And of course, hopefully you know that there is a piece upstairs. Well, we just jumped from 320 to 325. Arius. And we already talked about Arianism. He gave his own pretty good definition of what Arianism is in your readings. The bishop of Alexandria at the time was Alexander, Bishop Alexander. He had condemned Arius and removed him from his office as priest. And he was banned from going into cities in the empire by Constantine, Arius was. But he appealed to the people and to bishops that were friendly to him and friends of Arianism, I guess you would say. And so the conflict continued, and Constantine stepped in and called a council, which turns out to be the first ecumenical council. And it was in Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea in 325, which is up in here in Bithynia. It's not marked on this, but this is that isthmus piece of land that's sticking out, that's Constantinople here. So Nicaea is not very far from there.
Actually, Rome and Constantinople are really not that far apart, even in this day, by ship. I mean, right?
Right,
A few days.
right.
It's not like,
I guess, yeah.
I would assume.
I think someone worked it out recently using the trade winds and knowledge of the trade routes, and pretty much anywhere in the Mediterranean is 2 weeks from anywhere in the Mediterranean or less.
So the Council of Nicaea began, I think it was in May of 325, and lasted for several months. It was attended by over 200 bishops. Most of these bishops were from up in here, in the north, and particularly down in North Africa. If you want to call the West, there were 6 bishops from the West, 2 of whom were sent by Papa Sylvester, Pope Sylvester, or Patriarch Sylvester, to represent him. He did not go to the council. Arius went to the council, and at some point during the council activities, Arius stood and burst into song. Bill, could you read that? This is what he sang.
The uncreated God has made the Son, a beginning of things created, and by adoption has God made the Son into an advancement of himself. Yet the Son's substance is removed from the Father, and the Son is the teacher of all his mysteries. The members of the Holy Trinity share unequal glories.
Whereupon, as I think we mentioned once before, a bishop from Lycia by the name of Nicholas struck him. And I believe he was removed from office and then reinstated the next day, isn't it?
He's removed from the council, right?
Or removed from the council. And the patriarch, the presiding patriarch, had a vision that he should be reinstated, and so he was reinstated the next day. That's
Several people did.
St. Nicholas.
Did his vestments appear in his chamber? Were his vestments brought by angels to his chamber? I think I recall that from one of his stories.
Well, Arius persisted. I guess the strike didn't really hurt him that much because he's around for a while. Just my comment. What did the Council of Nicaea do? Well, it codified or said that Christ is very God of very God. It concluded that Christ is of one substance with the Father. So it did not accept Arianism, of course. It said that Christ was begotten, not made. It said that Christ became human for man's salvation. It passed the first canons, or I guess we could say church laws. It passed the first canons that related to the structure of the church, the offices and things, or offices. It called for the existence of provincial councils of bishops. This was an ecumenical council of all bishops, or all bishops that would come. But it called for provincial councils at smaller levels throughout the empire. Let's get together. Father Christopher and the other priests, for example, get together with Bishop Basil without the laity and other people every February. And it recognized Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch as jurisdictions or patriarchates. So now we can really stop referring to the senior bishops in these three places as bishops or papas or metropolitans. We can call them patriarchs.
Interesting that they didn't, Constantinople is not that way. Right?
Or Jerusalem.
But, well, it's kind of still early in Constantinople's life.
Well,
It's also interesting that they didn't in Jerusalem, but kind of predictable in view of what happened to Jerusalem. And those two other places would soon become
right.
patriarchal cities, which incidentally then would be the five patriarchates that we recognize today. So the first ecumenical council in 325 was pretty significant. I didn't mention it specifically, but it also codified the Nicene Creed. That's why they call it the Nicene Creed. There were some changes made to it at the next ecumenical council, but it created the creed. In 325, almost immediately, there was a heresy that appeared called Eusebianism, or semi-Arianism. It was a response to the decisions made at the Council of Nicaea, which were against Arianism. So maybe in a way you can say this was something that was thought up to like, okay, well if you don't accept that, let's change Arianism a little bit so that it's more acceptable. You can also call it binitarianism instead of trinitarianism, Trinity. And we'll see why in just a minute, but it was started by Eusebius of Nicomedia. Not the Eusebius historian that we've talked about. It was supported by other bishops, Basil of Ancyra or Ancira, Gregory of Laodicea. Ancira is on here somewhere, but I'm not gonna. It's there. These two individuals were close associates of someone else that's going to become very significant in the history of the church and the theology of the church, Basil the Great. But at this point, he differed from them. He did not buy into this, or Arianism. It said that Christ is similar in essence to the Father, but subordinate. It said the Son is always with the Father, so it's still Arianism. And it said the Holy Spirit is not a Godhead, which is why we can call it binitarianism as opposed to trinitarianism, Trinity. It was condemned by the Council in Constantinople in 360. What, 35 years later? Constantine, who kind of waffled on this business of Arianism or non-Arianism, actually made this Eusebius the Bishop of Constantinople in 328. And that, in fact, precipitated the exile of Athanasius, He had to go up into Germany. But he came back. Constantine's sons, who at various times were the dominant ruler of the empire, were some Arians and some non-Arians. So we went into a period where the thing to be for a few years was Arian, and then switch to Constantius II or whatever, and the thing to do for a while was definitely to not be Arian, and then back to that. I mentioned that in 330 there was also a heresy of Encratitism. Well, they were also called abstainers. And it's not particularly dominant or anything, but I mention it because it especially appeared among these developed monastic communities in North Africa. It was sort of endemic to the monastic communities. A very conservative approach, of course, as you would expect monastics to be. No meat or wine, no marriage, no recognition of Paul's epistles as scripture. Woman is the word of Satan. Sorry, Jimmy. Natural secretions of the body are sinful. In 382, they were taken care of.
Well, number 2 is gonna limit them in length of existence.
Right.
Yeah, you'd think you could just send them all to one island and they just die out.
So, Mike, could you look up Matthew 19:21? Antony the Great Saint Anthony was born in 251 and lived to 356. My goodness. For 105 years. He went into the Egyptian desert because of his exposure to Matthew 19:21.
Jesus said to him, if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in the heaven, and come follow me.
So he did precisely that, and he went into the Nitrian desert of Egypt and basically lived the rest of his life there. At the time, the bishop, or much of the time of his life, the bishop or patriarch of Alexandria was Athanasius, who became known as Athanasius the Great. They knew each other, periodically visited one another. Antony wrote, he was not a highly educated person, but he lived in the desert. He dealt with with demons and had a hard time. And he did write letters to the monastic communities around him. You know, he basically developed quite a large following of Eremitic monastics. There is the story of him that he and some monks were visiting a place in Egypt, a city called Crocodilopolis. And it was a city that had a moat around it with water, and the water was full of crocodiles. And when they came to this, to go into the city, I don't know whether they could have gone across a bridge or not, but Antony led them through the moat, and the crocodiles stayed away. He's a prototype of a spiritual guide, an Abba, a father. And he was a father to many monks in the desert. There are some readings that you will get of his. Athanasius didn't live quite as long, but you can see that there was a great deal of time when they were contemporaries. 295 to 373. He actually went to the Council of Nicaea as a deacon, because at the time the bishop was, or patriarch was Alexander. And he succeeded Alexander in 328. And as I mentioned, because of Eusebius and Constantine's appointment of him, he was exiled by the Arians to Germany, to Trier. And as I also mentioned, things kind of switched back and forth between the Constantines in terms of Arianism and anti-Arianism, and therefore he was exiled on 5 separate occasions during his life. So he spent a lot of time not in Alexandria. But he was loved and welcomed when he came back each time. Sometimes he went up the Nile, and there is a story about him that he was escaping, going on the Nile in a boat in one direction. I don't know which direction. And it was a time of anti-Arianism, or of Arianism, and so the emperor at the time had sent soldiers to capture him. And so they were going in a different direction, and they came in this boat close to his boat and said, "Have you seen Athanasius?" And he very quickly, I'm sure, answered, "Yes, hurry, he is very near." And they went on up the river. He was called the Black Dwarf. He was dark-skinned, he was an African, and he apparently was short. He was called that, I guess, by... he was very controversial and straightforward. And so he made enemies as well as close friends. He's also known as the defender of the faith and the father of orthodoxy. And a phrase that is associated with him in the literature is Athanasius contra attendum, which means Athanasius against the world. He was big on separation of church and state. When the emperor is in his empire or in his palace, he's the boss from a civil perspective. When the emperor is in a church, he's subject to God and to the bishop. He's not the big cheese there. He was a strong proponent of monasticism. And as I mentioned, a friend of St. Anthony. In fact, he wrote a biography on Antony called On the Incarnation. No, that's not right. He wrote a book called On the Incarnation. But he also wrote a biography on Antony. Those are two different things.
Do we have the biography? Do you know? Do we?
And you have some interesting excerpts from both of these things, or at least from On the Incarnation in your readings. That biography is really an interesting book. He was a proponent of certainly cooperation between the church and the state, but division. Without his, well, we saw a statement here about Constantine, that he never came under the church and that he considered himself the bishop of bishops. Without Athanasius' strongly held position of the separation of church and state, it's possible, I suppose, that orthodoxy would have become a state religion and a state-controlled religion. It may have become an imperial church, subject or subservient to the state, but it did not. Perhaps particularly interesting is that I believe by this time it was customary for patriarchs to write paschal letters. Or at least some of them did.
Yes. And Alexandria was particularly important because of the astronomical center there. So we would also send out a letter that would kind of set the date for Pascha, I believe. Tell everyone when Pascha was.
Right. And so in 367, Athanasius wrote this paschal letter, which had come out in prior years, and its purpose was to set the date of Pascha for that year. But in that, he also mentioned what he thought should be the books of the New Testament. And you remember there were one or more heresies that had different ideas and kind of precipitated this response by the church. But the important point is that the New Testament that we observe today is exactly what he said should be the New Testament in 367.
And that is, as far as we know, the first time
Right,
it's listed
right.
as is.
That's it.